Hola, estamos aquí una vez más con Red Cultural TV y nos acompaña una invitada muy interesante de la Universidad de Bath Spa. Ella es Fiona Peters y ella se dedica a crime fiction, a novela policial. Y vamos a hacerle algunas preguntas para poder conocer más acerca de este interesante género. Hi Fiona, welcome to Red Cultural TV. I wonder when crime fiction comes out and what is the difference between that gender in literature, between mystery, gothic and other things? Why is crime fiction something specific?
Crime fiction is something which came out of several different movements in literature. Gothic is only one of them. So I would distance crime fiction from Gothic because some crime fiction has Gothic elements, but much crime fiction does not have any Gothic elements to it. It also comes out of sensation fiction in the mid-19th century, plus it developed as a kind of literary representation of the development of policing and crime in the United Kingdom. Anyway, it's very different from the United States or in Europe. But in the United Kingdom, it really developed from different traditions such as the Gothic, sensational fiction and so on, and also the developments in the police force that emerged from the 1830s onwards. So I think that in America, crime fiction is known as suspense and mystery fiction. Yeah. In the UK, it's known as crime fiction. They are, in fact, the same thing. In fact, I would argue that what is known as literary fiction is actually crime fiction because we're all fascinated by criminality and the criminal act, morality, guilt, all of those things. You have those ingredients and you can produce crime fiction from anywhere.
And what was the role of, for instance, now it's very fashionable again because they're making very fancy TV series on Agatha Christie's novel. What was the role of her in this sort of new movement?
Well, Agatha Christie was part of, in fact, she's probably the writer who most people have heard of, apart from Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes. Agatha Christie was part of what we call the golden age of crime fiction, which occurred roughly between the First and the Second World Wars in Britain. And so crime fiction already existed as a genre when Agatha Christie started writing. And I think it's what people know when they think about British crime fiction. They think Agatha Christie. And I think she's quite underrated as a writer because she is so very well known. And she's known for being comfortable because, in fact, the cases are always solved and so on and so forth. But I think she's much more than that. The golden age of crime fiction reflected the anxieties in Britain during the period between the First and the Second World Wars, when people retreated back into their society, and crime fiction at that time was so huge because it gave people a safe version of a world where bad things get made better by solving a crime. So therefore, things that had been causing the British people so much anxiety could then be, if you like, displaced onto a novel where everything is back to a kind of normal by the end of that. And I think that in times of crisis and anxiety, the general public tend to return to those kind of narratives because a lot of crime fiction do not have the same kind of narrative structures at all. But Agatha Christie is now very popular. In fact, we have at my Captivating Criminality conference in Bath in a couple of weeks, one of my keynotes is Sophie Hannah, who is an author who is famous in her own right for psychological fiction. But she has been writing, she was asked to write more Poirot. So she has been writing further Poirot novels in the style of Agatha Christie, and they are proving extremely popular. It's quite interesting. And also all of the television adaptations, they also show a certain kind of Englishness. And I mean Englishness here, because of the settings and the costumes, and everything is more straightforward than people's everyday lives.
Yes, indeed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Sherlock Holmes and one of the key figures. What was the role of Conan Doyle, and why is he the icon of a detective?
Well, I think sometimes it's a question of luck, apart from anything else. I like Sherlock Holmes, but this is not really my favourite kind of crime fiction. Yeah. I think part of it actually relates to the way that it was produced at the time, because a lot of the early detective fiction followed the same mode of production as Charles Dickens and came out in magazines every week.
Yes.
So people could buy the magazine every week. They could read one instalment of a Dickens novel. They could read a Sherlock Holmes short story. So that kind of captivated the readership of the time. And Sherlock Holmes appears in mainly short stories. I teach The Hound of the Baskervilles, but it's quite a short book, very easy, very accessible. And of course, it has one of the main kind of features in crime fiction, the sidekick, Watson. In the famous rules, Van Dyne's rules on crime fiction, he says that the detective has to be more clever than the readers, but still allow the readers to follow along. So a sidekick like Watson is of the same intelligence level as the reader. So through Watson, we are seeing Sherlock Holmes through his eyes. Because I think if the Sherlock Holmes stories were from the perspective of Holmes himself, they wouldn't be quite so addictive, because he's got to be cleverer than us and Watson. So if you read the Holmes books, they're mainly narrated by Watson.
Yeah, and it's the character that I think readers love in a certain way, because Sherlock Holmes is too odd to some others.
And cold and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and have probably no feeling. What do you think about the new version in television of Sherlock Holmes? How about Sherlock and Cumberbatch version?
I have to confess, I don't watch it.
And you don't?
No, I don't. No, I don't watch it.
Oh, yeah. You have to. You will like it. It's different.
I have watched a few of them, but because, as I say, Sherlock Holmes is... my students all love Sherlock Holmes. When they start my second year class, and I say to them, we're only doing Sherlock Holmes for 2 weeks. And after that, I want you to learn about crime fiction, not just Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if it's crime fiction is apart from Sherlock Holmes, and this is a pick by chance in some way, which one are the highest point, apart from Agatha Christie, that is the golden age in a certain way, but it develops until now?
The golden age.
Which one is the highest point of crime fiction production?
In terms of sales, or in terms of the best?
The best.
Well, obviously Patricia Highsmith, because she is the crime fiction writer. I've written a book on her, and most of my research is on Patricia Highsmith. And I think that when my students come on to read Patricia Highsmith, they just fall in love with her. They fall in love with the character of Tom Ripley, because he is not a detective, he's not a policeman, he is a killer. And through the narrative, Highsmith seduces the reader into identifying with this killer, wanting him to get away with it, which he does. And if you ask, I speak to and interview a lot of crime fiction writers myself, and you ask them, who is your favourite writer? Who would you like to write? Like, it's always her. And the interesting thing about her is that she was never accepted as part of the genre of crime fiction because she's too transgressive. But she was also never accepted as women's writing literary fiction either because she wrote crime fiction. So she's endlessly fascinating because of that, really. And I think that those writers who break those boundaries are the most interesting. I'm also writing a book at the moment on Ruth Rendell.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of her.
Yes, I know.
She writes as Barbara Vine, and very, very psychological crime fiction. And these are the books that people can read again and again and again, because those ideas of resolution, the killer or the anti-hero being punished have disappeared now in crime fiction.
This unpunished evil character and fascinating one, it's part of the 21st new view of the world?
Well, not really. I mean, Highsmith created her character Tom Ripley in 1955. She was very interested and influenced by existentialism.
Yeah, but after
and those
the
kind
Second
of
World
movements
War,
after the Second World War. So I think that when people return, and people do return to the whodunit format, they do it in a kind of postmodern way.
Yes.
Because it hasn't passed its sell-by date, because people still want to read that all the time. But writers want to, obviously, they have to introduce the more psychological. They also have to introduce forensics and all of those new technologies into their novels. There's been, I think in the 21st century, there's been an upsurge in troubled policemen and women.
Yeah.
So that you have the policeman or woman who is a maverick figure, who is always in trouble, and they're always being threatened with being taken off the case if they don't behave. And then they don't behave, and then they solve the crime. So I think that the anti-hero figure has also become merged with the policeman or policewoman today.
Have something of that probably been in relationship of the creation of the high bureaucracy that do not allow you to do what you have to do in certain moments. And finally, the private investigator for one side, or the policeman that breaks the law, other one that finally solves things. Because in order to solve something, you need to skip this bureaucracy?
Yes, and I think that I was talking to Ian Rankin, who's a well-known contemporary crime fiction writer, and he was saying with his detective Rebus, who has an alcohol problem, who is always in trouble, he says you still, if you are writing about a police force that exists, and he sets his books in Edinburgh, the fans will immediately spot when something is wrong, or when the policeman is doing something that they would not be allowed to do within that structure of that police force. So it's quite a difficult task to make that character interesting, so he has to be this strange person. With a private detective, there are fewer private detectives in British crime fiction than there used to be. We tend to get them in American crime fiction more, especially since the days of Raymond Chandler in the 40s and 50s, then leading up to the post-feminist, the sort of post-second wave feminist heroes or heroines, Girls with a Gun, created by Sarah Paretsky and so on. So I think in America there are fewer police novels now, but in Britain they tend to be working within those structural boundaries, which always existed right from the development of the police force, but are more, they're stricter today, I think.
Today there's a sort of new gender that they call noir, one that is related with you speak yesterday, I hear about you, domestic suspense and crime that is very fashionable.
Yes, domestic noir is a new term that apparently was invented by two academics over a glass of wine one night at a conference in 2013. And I've just written a chapter for a book, a collection on domestic noir. And in my chapter, I argue that domestic noir has been happening for a very long time. It just wasn't labelled as such. There's a lot of debate at the moment about whether or not the heroines of novels like Girl on a Train or Gone Girl are heroines, or if they're kind of pathological.
Yes.
I think that, and so the debate around that tends to be with the representation of female heroines and the issues in not just the home but in relationships and so on and so forth, usually not involving the police except on a sort of peripheral level. I would say that they're thrillers. They are crime, but they're more thrillers than the strict way that we speak of crime fiction.
What is the barrier between thriller and crime fiction?
Well, Val McDermid, a very well-known British rather, Scottish actually, crime fiction writer, argued recently, and there's been some debate about this, that thrillers are right-wing and crime fiction is left-wing.
Okay.
And she said, and there's been a lot of debate about this, and she said because crime fiction reflects all of the social, political and other elements that are going on in a society. It has to, because if you have a police force or even a private detective, they have to engage with communities. They have to be involved in social issues. They will always be included in the books, or the books don't really look, then they look too focused. Whereas in a thriller, some thrillers, the traditional idea of a thriller, has the big bureaucracy where the hero doesn't know who he's fighting against, for example. And for these days, the idea of domestic noir really doesn't involve detection either.
Yeah.
We very much know what is kind of going on, and when we find out at the end, it's really nothing to do with the way in which a crime fiction novel has to, in one way or another, tie up its endings. Even Patricia Highsmith has to do that, letting Tom Ripley go to the next novel to keep killing people if that's what he feels like doing. But it still has to follow a slightly different formula. So I think that it's a difficult distinction, and they just spill over into each other at the moment. I think the reading public is sophisticated enough to know that they are divided into what's good and what isn't good. It's a better distinction, perhaps.
Yeah, and I imagine that because crime fiction is so popular, there are still the amount of books produced in time. Many of them are rubbish, and there are some heights point, but people looks as like the gender as something not deep intellectual or something like that.
Yes, I think because crime fiction is so popular, a lot gets published which is rubbish.
Yeah.
But with what's so-called literary fiction, that which is rubbish does not usually get published, or maybe it does, but not many people will read it. So that if you're... and also the other element of that, which is quite important, is quite a lot of crime fiction writers today write series.
Yes.
So people will talk about the new Val McDermid or the new Rebus book, either the name of the author or the name of the detective. And so therefore they will identify with a certain strand. Now, those can be very good in the case of Val McDermid or Ian Rankin, or they can also be quite escapist. And there is a distinction between, like in any other kind of literature, between that which makes you think and changes your ideas about things and that which you read and then forget. But in crime fiction, obviously, because it's so popular, you're going to find those books at airports and read them and just throw away, which is less likely in literary fiction, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's where popular fiction is interesting. There are other, obviously, genres in popular fiction, but we all like to think we can solve a crime.
Stieg Larsson is crime fiction?
Yes. My Swedish friend says that the English translations of those books are not good. And in Swedish they are much better. Their translations were rushed out, actually, after he died.
I imagine so. Yeah. He was very popular, and the movies, the different version, because it was not just one version. Makes him here in Chile very popular. So I imagine.
Yes, there's a tendency in crime fiction to put labels on things. And Nordic or Scandinavian noir, as it's called, has been very popular, I think, with Stieg Larsson and also with other writers such as Jo Nesbø, the Wallander series, and so on and so forth. And I think that was very popular for quite some time. And when I teach crime fiction, I'm very keen to teach about place, how important place is in these novels. And so a place almost becomes a character in quite a lot of crime fiction. And I think the emphasis is shifting away a little bit from Nordic noir at the moment. And that's one of the things I'm very interested in coming to South America.
Yeah, probably it's an addition of mystery and far away coldness or something like that that makes it so interesting for people.
Oh, it's very good for the tourism industry. In Iceland, there are so many crime fiction writers, and they almost never have any crime in Iceland. So it's a fantasy that's created in those places. And I would like to see more interest in, Latin American crime fiction, because now we're also moving on to French, German, European crime fiction as well. So I think that Nordic noir is perhaps losing its edge at the moment, which is interesting.
We will try to get some Chilean interesting to participate in your conference. We as Red Cultural, by sure next year, will try to match our trip or one of our trip with your conference. So thank you very much to join us here in Red Cultural TV, and I hope that you come back to Chile again, probably in the next years.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos.